I want to welcome you to what I hope will be an hour of really useful discussion about faculty restructuring. So I want to explain a little bit about what the purpose of this particular session is. This session and the one that I'll mention that we're going to hold on October 7th has been called and designed as an opportunity for sharing and discussing the faculty restructuring proposals that have been put forward by Provost Steve Dew and the Academic Restructuring Working Group. They have put forward 3 scenarios to be debated, and they've opened the stage for revisions on those scenarios, for additions to those scenarios. And I thought it was really important that in addition to participating in anything that's been organized by the provost or the president, or General Faculty's Council as opportunities to provide input, that we should have some conversations in the Faculty of Arts where we get to share our concerns, share our perspectives, share our dreams related to these, and through that come to a better understanding of what our views are about these scenarios. So we've proposed this event today, which is a lunchtime event, so it'll run for 60 minutes. We've also proposed that we will have a similar kind of discussion on October 7th at 3:30 p.m. in the afternoon. That was originally going to be 60 minutes, and somebody suggested to me that 60 minutes isn't a lot of time for this kind of discussion, so we've made that 90 minutes. And I can tell you today that we will soon be informing everyone that the president and provost will be holding a separate town hall for the Faculty of Arts on October 14th from 2 until 3 p.m. So that was just arranged at the end of the day on Friday. And as soon as we can, we'll confirm all the details and get information out about that. So what we're doing here today is having a discussion. My goal is to have the discussion related to faculty restructuring, but you know that there's an awful lot going on around campus in terms of administrative restructuring. And we will soon be putting forward ideas about departmental restructuring. And we can't really separate faculty restructuring from administrative restructuring, from departmental restructuring. So I won't be surprised if other things come up in the process of our discussion. But the goal here is to be sharing and thinking about our views of the 3 scenarios that have been put forward by the Academic Restructuring Working Group related to faculty restructuring. I don't want to say too much. I'm going to try to moderate this discussion. I'm happy to answer questions that I can answer. There will be many that I can't answer. And I'm going to, as Dean, take a lot of what I hear here forward into future discussions that I'm involved with, but I hope it will also help you shape your views so that when, for example, the president and provost come to the Faculty of Arts on October 14th, your views are really well developed and you can articulate the positions and concerns you have directly to them. So as we're getting started, I wanted to thank Claire and Cindy for organizing this, and Sheila, Jerry, for making sure that a lot of you could be here. I think there's probably 150 people signed up by the time we were getting rolling. And I just want to say that the chat function is open and available, but we're not going to be using the chat function to run this meeting. What we're going to do to have our discussion is make use of the blue hands. So if you click on participants at the bottom, you can find the place for raising your blue hand. And I will try to keep track of the blue hands and invite people into the discussion. I would ask that you be succinct so that you don't take up too much time. I will try to avoid speaking after every speaker so that we don't get into a I speak, you speak, I speak kind of scenario, but I want to hear from you and I want you to be speaking to one another as well. And if somebody can't find the blue hand and you've been waiting and waiting, you can also do this in the screen and I might see you, or just bang your computer and sometimes a little yellow box appears and you jump onto the first screen because we have 4 screens of faces and I might see you in that way and be able to invite you into the conversation. And for anybody who is uncomfortable with so many people, you want to make sure I hear them and I carry them forward, you can also email me at artsdean@ualberta.ca and I'll try to respond to your concerns. We've actually had so many emails and this stuff. One of the things we're trying to figure out this morning is how we're going to find an appropriate time to give reasonable and thoughtful responses to everyone. So welcome. Thank you for being here. You know, I could say a lot more to set the stage, but I'm assuming people have looked at the 3 scenarios. I'm assuming you're ready to share views, And I'm waiting for blue hands to appear in my list of participants. I'm interested in hearing what you have to say and the conversation that leads to. Michael Furstoff, please jump in and begin our discussion.
I've been in on some of the meetings on those three plans, and one of the questions that comes to me is, it isn't clear how they're going to save all the money that they need to save. And to what extent do you think that the Faculty of Arts is going to have to, chip in the remainder? Because the total amount of savings required is an awfully big number. Mm-hmm. And they just sort of say vaguely, faculties may have to reorganize departments and things, but I'm not sure how do you see the implications of that?
Well, I think what's clear is there's a small amount of savings to happen from academic restructuring. Maybe I shouldn't say small, maybe I should say mid-level savings, because we can reduce our expenses on administrators and so on. But the real savings that the president is trying to realize are going to come through administrative restructuring, or the Sept initiative, Service Excellence Transformation. Just so that I'm not talking, and this I'm hearing from you, academic restructuring is going to be a much smaller percentage of the savings that can be realized than administrative restructuring. And administrative restructuring is being managed through the Sept process. And it's not going to be, like you said, the Faculty of Arts chipping in. It's going to be every single faculty and every single department having to respond to the decisions made in the context of the Sept initiative and responding to those in the way that we think is most productive. That's where the savings are going to be made. And I think the savings are largely going to be made because we're going to have fewer staff. And to the extent that we can be more efficient, like the president has been emphasizing, we can weather that storm. But we have to do a lot of planning to be ready for that. Oliver.
Thanks.
I've been around campus sort of 20 years, and I've seen a lot of so it's almost called, for me, it's institutional breathing. It's like centralize and then decentralize and centralize and decentralize. And it's actually an extremely valid process, because as an organization, we grow and we change our needs. So when I look at these three options, and okay, I'm going to set aside kind of the questions of where the money is saved, because I actually have concerns and curiousness about that too. But I mean, at a certain level, my curiosity about how we're going to get the dollars meets this massive change in the budget from the Alberta government. And I just think, well, anything we can do has to be a useful thing and a step forward to finding a solution to this massive gap that the provincial government gave the university. So for me, when I look at the three scenarios, and I think about this breathing, this institutional breathing, and I think about the teams that I've worked with over the years, and how, when we're looking for research collaborations, we look along our stream, along a stream of social sciences, humanities, and arts. So for me, the option B, which is this kind of a cluster along the tri-council streams, makes a lot of sense. As a starting point, it's an interesting dialogue to explore how we can consolidate efforts along a research stream that aligns with our major federal funding. The nuts and bolts of how you make that alignment becomes quite complex, especially when you start thinking of superior dean, or whatever they're going to be called, higher up dean. Now, that was just a long comment. Is that sort of along the lines of what you're looking for?
That's really useful, and it's important to understand that there's an awful lot of details that Steve has not been able to flesh out. Some of which would be fleshed out before implementation, some of which would need to be fleshed out during implementation. And one of the significant things that I want to be thinking about and hearing from people about is the exact executive leadership structure that is appropriate for a division that is headed by an executive dean, and appropriate for an academic faculty headed by a faculty dean. We know from Steve Dew's presentations, and anybody who sat in on GFC yesterday saw the suggestion that research, graduate studies, international, equity, diversity, and inclusion would be things that an executive dean and their associate deans would take leadership of, programs, et cetera. being things that the academic deans would take leadership on with their associate deans. I think we need to think carefully about how that can work, about what are our challenges and concerns about that. Heather Coleman raised some yesterday in her intervention in GFC, because we need to have thoughtful input on those kinds of matters if we found ourselves moving towards scenario B. Peter Cinema, you were up next.
My question has to do with departments and what the faculty is thinking on that lower tier front. I think one of the mythologies that's being produced in the discussions or the threats to merge departments or eliminate departments or whatever, you don't put departments together and then ta-da, some kind of interdisciplinary new formation emerges. I belong to a department that's had another department move in with it at the administrative level. And we get along well enough, English and film studies, but they're two really separate disciplines simply housed under a similar administrative structure. So interdisciplinarity doesn't emerge by stuffing departments together. What happens is, I mean, my own commitment to my department has to do with a commitment to a discipline that trained me and then that hired me. So the Department of English is something that I really cherish. And I think most faculty members like departments, and they want to belong to a department that represents what they are professionally. So I have concerns and worries about what kind of discussions are happening behind the scenes about departments. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about where arts is on that front.
Well, there's a lot of discussions. Hopefully they don't all feel like they're behind the scenes, because they're being led by our chairs, and our chairs should be very connected with their departments. And some of this is taking place in departmental councils. One of the things that's become really clear is that when it comes to departmental restructuring, the mistake is to be thinking about how we take our departments and merge or amalgamate them. What we need to be thinking about is our programs. So use the word disciplines. Sometimes the disciplines and programs line up, sometimes they're a little bit out of line, but we should be thinking about our programs. And most of the chairs have come together around the idea that if we need to be moving in the direction of having some larger departments and fewer small ones, fewer departments overall, which I think is going to be necessary to weather the kinds of administrative cuts that we're going to have. We need to be bringing programs together that have real affinities, that really work together. And then we have to confront the challenge of having multi-program departments. And in some cases, particularly in the fine arts, multi-degree departments. And that is a big challenge, because departments and departmental councils have governing processes. But whatever we do, we have to make sure that the governing processes are also functioning at the program level, so that programs have on the ground, sort of locally around that program, control over the future of that program and the decisions that are really significant to that program. So multi-program departments need a structure for making sure that we have that kind of on the ground control. So it's not a simple matter, but what the chairs are doing right now is there's two groups of chairs. One is thinking about academic restructuring, which I think of as the administrative architecture. What kind of departments should we have? Just like Steve Dew presented us some scenarios of what kind of faculties we should have. The other group of chairs is looking at academic leadership and administration. What does it mean to bring some programs together in a new context that will allow them to govern themselves, even though they are part of a department that is part of a faculty and perhaps part of a division, that allow them to govern themselves, allow them to protect and foster the identity that they have as a field of study or a discipline, and will make sure that students can understand and approach them in the right way. So part of this is just about how we communicate and share who we are as a Faculty of Arts and what our programs are. And part of it is about how we govern ourselves. So the things you've landed on are the challenges. And sometimes some of the people leading all this academic restructuring will say, faculties and departments are just administrative units. And that's sort of true, but it's not really true. They're more than that. They're small communities, and they're communities that have to govern themselves. So our challenge is to work through exactly what you're talking about. Next week, Chair's Council will release some ideas, not full-blown scenarios that we have to choose one or another, but some ideas for restructuring our departments that we will be having lots of discussion about. And then we'll go back to Chair's Council, do some rethinking based on what we hear, and eventually come forward with proposals that would be discussed widely and then voted on at Arts Faculty Council. So I think you've hit the nail on the head. I've heard that same kind of thing from departments like Women's and Gender Studies that has been a program for a long time, but worked hard to become a department. What happens if they get merged with some other department? What do they lose, and what can we do to protect the things they lose? The East Asian Studies Students Association wrote me a really thoughtful letter about their concerns about being part of a larger department. And the concerns they raised are the concerns we were already thinking about, and that we have to find answers to. So hopefully that partly answers your question. Partly it's just an endorsement that you've nailed it in terms of what our challenges are. Mary is next up on the list of speakers.
Hi, Steve. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to all of us. I know we all have different sort of thoughts and concerns and our own units. So just to take us to advancement a little bit, I listened in to GFC yesterday, and there was sort of the executive dean potentially under scenario B, and then sort of some associate deans. And my thinking there is, if that's where the assistant dean advancement was to sit, that would be excellent to see sort of a bigger team that can get more work done, potentially cross different faculties and divisions. We see with some of our larger gifts, like one that has recently come in that would be across Native Studies, education, and arts from a corporation, that there are sort of some efficiencies to be realized there. So just wanted to kind of put the bug in your ear about that would be a place that we could really work with advancement and get some good work done, and see if maybe you had some thoughts about where some of those administrative people would sit yet.
Well, I mean, when you raise a question like that, you're talking about that space where academic restructuring meets administrative restructuring. What I've been trying to do is take seriously the logic behind the SET initiative about administrative restructuring and some of the logic behind academic restructuring. Even if my perspective might, be a little bit different, then I've been trying to take that seriously. And I really think that there are some processes and activities that can be taken out of the hands of people who should be making more of a real difference to our research and our teaching, and just move that somewhere, like the transaction hub idea that SET is developing. I also think there are economies of scale that can be had, and advancement is a perfect example. Advancement, perhaps there is a logical case to be made for advancement. Right now we have an assistant dean advancement, to see that at the division level rather than the academic faculty level, so that you've got a larger team that has more resources and more capacity. But as the Dean of Arts, if that's the way we're moving, I also want the attention from that team that we need, and not only the attention, but the knowledge. People who understand arts and understand our programs and understand our research. The logic behind the SET initiative is about specialization and centralization. And it's a logic that can save money, but it's also a logic that puts at risk the valuable generalists that we have in our departments, and sometimes can sort of underplay the importance of local knowledge. What I mean by local knowledge is knowledge of programs and departments and faculties. So I think as we move in those directions, we need to be thinking, okay, what are the economies of scale and the administrative savings, et cetera, but how do we also make sure things work for us? And in a sense, that's part of my job as dean, is to sort of navigate those boundaries and push the agendas that I think are important.
Great, thank you.
Pete.
Thank you, Steve, for organizing this. Yeah, And very good questions. I want to pick up on what Oliver brought up in terms of the scenario B. Before I do that, I have actually, and I was like you at GFC yesterday, where we had some, very valuable input from a lot of members. It was a great discussion, although not quite satisfactorily responded to, I thought, but anyway. So one of my big concerns also for the Faculty of Arts is where the students are in all of this and how they are consulted, the student bodies, the student community. I find it remarkably absent in a lot of the discussions, and obviously they're going to be greatly affected by one thing, and that is a whopping increase of tuition fees, which is coming down the pipeline. But also by other things, right? Like the administrative changes and all of that. So I think we seem to largely forget where the students are in this. And that's a question to you, Steve. Where are the students in the Faculty of Arts discussions within this process? Another concern I have, this is sort of outside of this, is FGSR continuously seems to be dismissed as something that is not relevant in terms of, say, there's no professors there. Well, the leadership of FGSR, I don't understand that observation. And another one is the Faculty of Medicine, which also is continuously sort of like waved off. Oh, these are other logarithms, other formulas. These don't come into this equation. So where do they come in and how do they come in? Now, in terms of what Oliver brought up with point B, there was a very interesting intervention yesterday at GFC by Ted Allison, who is from biology, from sciences. And he really made me think a lot about that. This whole thing about grouping alongside the three funding bodies might be a bit too self-evident and too easy. It's sort of like a sugary pill to swallow. Because one of the things he brought up is, obviously, well, there are two things. Obviously, you create rich faculties and poorer faculties. That's very, very clear with how these funding bodies are structured and what they do. That's one. And two, what if the politics of these funding bodies change? I mean, just imagine a conservative government coming in Ottawa and changing shirk politics and policies. I mean, there's a real danger there that a structuring that follows these funding body structures is then also going to be much more greatly affected, and of course won't be easily undone, because I mean, we want to go through this every 3 or 4 years when there is another government elected. And on that point, I actually thought that the self-evidence with which what Steve Dew, I think, called community faculties, which is Augustana, Faculty Saint Jean, and Native Studies, are also, as it were, in all three scenarios, I would use the word remaindered, to a certain extent, both saved as well as forgotten. I find that also troubling, and I'd like to read and hear a bit more argumentation about that. I mean, I have a lot to do with Faculty Saint Jean, for instance, so, and I'm sure other people have too. And there's a lot of commonalities with education of what we do. So and with Augustana. So to sort of dismiss those three community faculties as not all that relevant in this process, I find not satisfactory. Thanks.
I jotted down the topics you raised, and I do want to come back to them, but I do want to avoid just answering questions. So yeah. I'll come back to everything after Sarah jumps in and adds some comments. Sarah Doral.
Thanks, Steve. This actually follows up on Pete. I think I'm chiming in as a member of the group of chairs that's looking at academic restructuring in arts, that fun task. And I have a question about, to get back to the scenarios at the university level. I think it'd be really useful to hear this group talk a bit about scenario B versus scenario C. A is clearly, I think, off the table. I think that's fair to say. B is clearly the favorite, but it seems like C has maybe a whisper of life. And I guess the question is, does it still have a whisper of life? And if so, how might we as arts enter that conversation to look at a different kind of structure? I'm interested in arts and science as an option for a number of reasons, including the one that Pete named, but also the ways in which that might create, it's more in keeping with structures at many other institutions, comparable institutions, and secondly, might make for a kind of a strong collaboration. So I think it'd be really useful to hear about that and how people think about those two scenarios next to each other. Thanks.
That's fantastic. So I'm going to say a few things, and hopefully some blue hands will come up wanting to talk about scenario B versus C. Pete referred to a number of things. One, he referred to sort of putting things together and the potential for collaborations and what are the right things to put together. I think one of the things I've been really struck by is all of the talk about interdisciplinarity. And I think we have to realize, regardless of structure, interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, collaboration doesn't happen because of academic structures. It happens because we do the things to make that happen. So that is not going to happen just because of any kind of putting things together. There's work that needs to be done. Pete raised FGSR, big questions about FGSR that have not been entirely worked out. So Steve Dew gave partial answers, but that's because there are many details still to come. FOMD, I think what the provost is trying to say is that when they were doing some calculations, their budget is so different that it was hard without a heck of a lot of extra work to throw in how things are happening. But I can tell you, when it comes to things like departmental restructuring, the two faculties with lots of departments are FOMD and arts. And the Dean of Medicine and Dentistry and I have been talking together a lot about restructuring our departments, about how to approach it, how to have good conversations. And the two of us have met with the provost to ask him for answers to questions and to make it clear to him that we really want to work within our faculties on developing these things. The Academic Restructuring Working Group that the provost is responsible for will fairly soon set some parameters and expectations about departmental restructuring. But the job of thinking that through is going to be ours, and it's going to happen in FOMD as well in one way or another. There's a lot of other things that Pete raised. One is, the university schools, Native Studies, Campus Saint Jean, Augustana. It's been a long and difficult process for them already, and we're only partway through this academic restructuring, because earlier thinking had them being rolled into other faculties. And there are really good reasons for Campus Saint Jean, for Native Studies to be standalone, whether they're standalone university schools or standalone faculties. And the decision was made by the Academic Restructuring Working Group to somehow not have them rolled into the divisions or rolled into other faculties. Because early on, there was the idea that Native Studies could become a part of the Faculty of Arts. But exactly what a university school is and how it operates and how the budget model touches them and how executive leadership will work, I think these are things that still need to be worked out. So moving on to scenario B versus scenario C, I really welcome what Sarah is encouraging, is that discussion of what do you think about B versus C. The real difference between B versus C for us in arts is in scenario B, we become one of 4 academic faculties within a division. The dynamics of our lives will change because of how the budget model ends up getting applied to the division and the faculties within the division. because of the opportunities for collaboration across faculties, but not as strong as really merged faculties, all of that. So that's, scenario B, the world where we'd be entering into. Scenario C is quite different for arts and science. If you look at all three scenarios, every faculty name is either in a box or beside a bullet point, other than the Faculty of Arts and Sciences in scenario C. And to me, that suggests a real merging of arts and science, which would be a very different kind of restructuring than B. B, it puts us in a new context within a division, having to manage that division, having to figure out how that works for our programs and our students and our research agendas. But scenario C takes us down a very different kind of road. And I've heard people express real concerns about that merger. And I've heard people express real enthusiasm and excitement about the possibility of a merged arts and science faculty. So I'd be interested to hear from others about that. That's the main purpose of this event, is really to get input on those sorts of things, but also other topics. Heather, please jump in.
This might be a slight change of topic, but the words transactional work versus value-added work has been thrown around, as well as calling advisors generalists. I would like to really point out that as an advisor, I don't think I'm a generalist. I think I specialize in graduate student programs and administration and advising, and to be labeled a generalist is, I think it kind of reduces our value. And I just hope that when the restructuring of arts actually happens, that people will be able to pay attention to what they're actually going to do to student supports once they change us to transactional workers.
Okay, those are incredibly important points. We find ourselves, when we're involved in conversations like this, sort of being sucked into the language of the day: transactional versus value-added work. I mean, what is that? Is that a bunch of jargon? What does it mean on the ground? And as somebody pointed out to me in one of my meetings with the Departmental Council, it also is sort of loaded with potentially ideological baggage as well. But the way I'm thinking about it is transactional work is work that doesn't require real knowledge of programs and of what's going on in a department or what's going on in a faculty. It's processing things that it doesn't matter where it's done. It's still important, but it could be done anywhere if it was possible to do it somewhere else. So some transactional work, the thinking is, should just be moved into a transactional hub somewhere so it can just happen. Value-added work is the work that makes a difference for our students and for our research. And undergraduate and graduate advisors, in my opinion, are doing value-added work. The thinking behind Sept is that many of those people are, in addition to doing the value-added work of being an advisor and making a difference in students' lives and supporting the programs, that many of them are stuck doing some transactional work, processing HR forms, perhaps processing finance forms that could be done in a transaction hub so that they can be more focused on the value-added work. In practice, that's not always that simple. For example, grad advisors like yourself, some of the transactional work they do that has to do with HR is actually really important to the graduate students that they're trying to assist, because these graduate students tend to be both students and employees. So it's a tough one to separate out, and tough to figure out how and when do you separate it out. In addition to that, the idea of privileging specialization rather over generalists doesn't always work. There are always cases, particularly in smaller units, which means you're getting into talking about departments, particularly in smaller units, generalists are what we need to get the job done and to survive, because there aren't enough people around in smaller units for everybody to be a specialist and everybody to be doing value-added work. And value-added just sounds wrong because it's demeaning to those doing transactional work, which actually is important as well. But so if you think about it that way, the logic of Sept and academic restructuring makes some sense. The challenge is navigating it to be responsive to the concerns you've raised, Heather. And that's sort of where I sit right now as a dean is, I've often said in meetings, don't forget generalists are actually times people are generalists for good reasons. I got a great email from somebody whose work would be described as a generalist because they do research work, finance work, and HR work. But what she explained to me was the sequencing of that into the annual calendar is such that it combines to make a manageable job, because her HR work is busy at a certain period of the year, her finance work is busy at a certain period of the year, and her research assistance work is busy at a certain period of the year. So it really works. And we have to somehow, when things are implemented, be able to think at the micro level of what's happening with real jobs and what's happening with grad advisors and so on. And I think grad advising is something that, to me, we need more clarity on. If grad is going to be part of divisions in terms of an associate dean responsibility, how does it flow from division through the faculties to the departments, or from the division to the departments? Because so much really important work on the grad side is done by grad advisors and associate chairs grad. So that needs an awful lot of attention. So I appreciate your comments. Kamala, you've got your blue hand up.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Thank you very much. Just a tech note, I just noted that when we hear the voices fading, I kind of found actually multiple mics have been unmuted. So moving forward, I think we can just, if you mute our mic right after speaking, I think that will help hearing. But anyway, I raised my hand to share a couple of thoughts about scenario B and scenario C. And one thing that made me quite strongly feel is that either way we go, we are actually not just moving units and integrating pieces, just like the way that we would redesign some kind of a jigsaw puzzle or a blocks, right? This work has a lot more associated with the culture. When we consider arts, for example, like these are long-standing faculties. They have their programs associated with their cultures, and then also when it takes the programs, they are not really only the academic part of it, but there's a whole ecosystem of support work that helped thriving these academic initiatives, research and teaching both. And different faculties and different units have different kind of practices. So we are looking at a very fast moving transition. And then considering that, in my understanding, I agree that scenario B can be seen as a sugar pill that you can easily swallow, but at the same time, it actually sort of keep that culture within a particular scope. When we consider the plan C, on the other hand, scenario C, it's a complete amalgamation, specifically speaking, arts and science together. I think it opens up the collaboration, but again, for those collaborations, it's more about how people interact with each other, and then their research interests go with each other rather than they are being housed in one faculty. So in my opinion, I think the scenario B would give us a little bit smoother transition, considering the entire underlying work and the underlying structures that are behind this academic phase, essentially. And related to scenario C, I have seen many universities uses that PAT model, but when we look at the little bit more details, their entire programming is very well intervened together. So in our interim report, I found somewhere it said the academic structuring is about providing the overall structure, but the individual initiatives will be done by individual faculties and departments. But I think when it comes to the examples in C, I can see that actually it's not necessarily the way that it's been happening elsewhere. So it's more about like rethinking everything. So those are a couple of thoughts that I wanted to share. And considering a smoother transition, I kind of feel the plan B or the scenario B would be more culturally sustainable or easier to implement. But at the same time, I agree with the challenges that, for example, if a tri-council funding change substantially, then it might have a bigger impact. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Kamal. Ricardo, I see your blue hand is up.
Sure, thanks, Steve. I kind of want to take off a little bit on Heather's points around transactional versus value-added work and build up on that to do a bit more of a kind of philosophical take, because those words do matter, and that kind of loaded language is throughout all of the report and throughout all of the proposal and scenarios that we've seen. One of the big concerns, though, in a very practical sense, is this notion of transactional work. And you made the reference to a simple financial transaction. The sad reality is that most of us in the academy are unique little snowflakes. We all exist in a very, very specialized space. And I come out of unit that's perhaps more of a snowflake than most, because we're so different than anything else. And in that scenario, there's really no such thing as a simple financial transaction. Every transaction is loaded and connected to a bunch of different other ripple effects. And if you've got somebody who is in an office far away from you, just doing that one financial transaction without understanding the context, without knowing how it connects to everything else you're doing, then that's going to cause way more problems than it solves. But I think, alternate language to things like transactional or value added is actually de-skilling, right? Like, what taking away that transactional work from that home base, from the geographic space, actually means and does is it removes agency. It removes the ability to make decisions. It removes the ability to support and provide. And it removes the people doing the work from a sense of ownership of the larger institution. And I think that's dangerous. I think that's especially dangerous because we're seeing a lot of this work being done to kind of distance us from our tradition. I think the language that I see in the report, to distance us from our tradition of collegial governance. We know that the provost has spoken a few times about one of the driving factors for him in all of this is to reduce the size of Dean's Council, right? Scenario B has a situation where we've got the provost sitting at Dean's Council with 3 super deans, essentially, which removes everybody under those 3 super deans one step further from decision-making, from strategic work, from that kind of participation in the academy. And I think for me, that's my biggest concern, is that what we're looking at here with language like transactional, value added, comparing all these costs, centralizing, we're really looking at a managerialist solution to what is an academic problem. And I think that's going to get us somewhere that's not good for our academic tradition, for our academic work, for our research work overall. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Ricardo. The risk of management language is something a lot of us have been aware of for a long time. People that study public administration, study political economy, we've been aware of that, and it's really significant. At the same time, the idea of transactional work is not just an ideologically loaded concept. When I talk to our assistant chairs, when I talk to people that have to process a lot of work, it's not uncommon for people to say, I got so much I want to do that is important in my department, and I'm stuck doing this particular work. And, if I could get that off my plate, it would make such a difference. So in practical terms, what I'm trying to do is keep my antennae up for exactly what you're concerned about, but also to take a look at what is the stuff that we're doing that is actually making us less effective at doing the things that matter to us. And I say that while respecting, one, that local knowledge about a simple financial transaction can be important. So I respect what you've said about that. But I've also been thinking a lot about sometimes when you move transactional work away, you create a new kind of work. That is the request for the transactional work. And that new kind of work can be a burden if processes aren't thought through really, really carefully. I think Steve Dew's concerns about having a smaller Dean's Council are really legitimate, but we also have to ask ourselves questions about what is an appropriate size for Dean's Council and how does it work really well. I think the two of the most important bodies on our campuses, and actually one of them is multiplied, are our Dean's Council and our Chairs Councils. Neither of them have any sort of governance authority to do things, but they play a huge role in shaping what our provost is doing and what our deans are doing. And we need Dean's Councils and Chairs Councils that can be really functional and collaborative spaces. And I can understand why Steve Dew says a Dean's Council with 18 is a difficult space for that. Whether Dean's Council for 3 is the real decision, the real sort of sweet spot for that is an open question. And how voices are heard from the academic deans, from the heads of the youth schools, is a really important question. And something that needs to be thought of. I can't imagine that we could move towards scenario B without having some kind of body of all of those faculty deans. But clearly the executive deans would be playing a unique role. And we need to understand that and make sure that the balance is as right as possible. So I appreciate what you're saying, and I think about it a lot, I can tell you. Kim, you've got your blue hand up as well.
Yeah, so I'm speaking as a member of the Department of Psychology, and I'm responding a little bit to Kamal's discussion about cultures and preferences for scenarios, and Sarah's question about, scenario B or C. And psychology, as you know, sits right on half in science, half in arts. And we've been dealing with those two cultures for a long time. And we've been through restructuring processes at least 3 times since I've been here, and still landed in both faculties. I've been one of the people who wants us to stay in 2 faculties, because psychology is an arts and a science. And I think there are many social sciences that could probably see themselves leaning both ways. In fact, I've never been in a university where psychology was solely in sciences or solely in arts. I've been in a university where it was in the Department of Social Science, and one where it was in a College of Arts and Science. So I think my point, and the first point I want to make is, yes, there are 2 cultures, but I don't think they're irreconcilable. And moreover, I think science needs a bit of arts culture in it. It's got a lot of issues that I think we handle much better than they do. And I think it would enrich them. It's not just about disciplinary or interdisciplinary collaboration. It's also about creating a richer work environment. And I'll just stop there.
I don't see another blue hand up, so I'll just sort of comment a little bit on that. As Dean of Arts, working with our chairs, but thinking about departmental restructuring, and then positioning that relative to the faculty restructuring, I'm really struck by the implications of being in scenario B in a division with education. Education also has a psychology department. We have a psychology department we share with science. There's differences between the science psychologists, the social science psychologists, and the clinical psychologists we find in other parts of campus. But if we ended up with scenario B, one of my curiosities is about the permeability of the boundaries between the academic faculties, and whether or not there are opportunities for psychologists to work together even more effectively across the education and arts boundary. And I've thought a lot about the same thing in relation to being in the same division as the School of Business, which also has a Department of Economics, and we have a Department of Economics. I'm sure I know there are some who would like to see those merged into one department, but there are other opportunities that might get partway there, and that they have to do with the relationships between those departments rather than actually merging them. But these kinds of things really need to be explored carefully and thoughtfully. And you can't help but wonder what What would the science side of psychology think about scenario B, and if we developed a stronger relationship with education psychology, for example, and what happens? There's real stresses and strains there, and things that we need to think carefully about, which is why some people really like the idea of a faculty of arts and science. But either way, there are things that need to be thought carefully about. Other blue hands, good. I saw Lise go up first, and then Kath Binhammer.
Hi, Steve, and thanks for doing this. I just wanted to, I watched also the GFC meeting yesterday, and I have a lot of concerns about option B, but I'm going to focus on a slide that Steve put up yesterday that had like the org chart. And so if we go all the way down to the departmental level, this is the way he envisions departmental leadership: a chair, one associate chair, one assistant chair. And so my question is, well, I have a couple of questions. One is, why are we not waiting to see how the faculty restructuring works out and gets concluded before we move into what is a really complicated task of rethinking our department? So I don't understand why we're doing that now. I think we should wait to see how the faculties get restructured first. I think that would make a lot more sense because the permutations could change. For example, if the faculty restructuring shakes down in such a way that, say, other sociologists from other parts of the university end up coming into the sociology department, that could really affect how we think about departments in arts. That's just one example. But then the second thing, I really want to focus on this department leadership team. Who the heck is going to do all the work? So you're envisioning much larger departments with multiple programs. Say, you know, there could be departments with 6 programs, and I'll draw your attention to a couple of things like unit reviews and program reviews are an enormous amount of work for any program. Who does that work in a department with that kind of a thin leadership structure? FEC is another challenge. Okay, so FEC, it's, you know, all set up in university policy, and chairs, of course, are members of FEC and defend cases at FEC, but they are not going to be familiar with the kind of cultures and standards across, like, you know, potentially 6 different programs. And let me tell you, being in a situation where I was a member of a program for a while that did not have a chair sitting at FEC, that really disadvantaged us at FEC, because the person who was presenting our cases and defending recommendations really didn't know very much about what we were doing. But if you say, oh, well, you know, there will be program directors and, you know, they can do the FEC work, well, then are they going to do that just as part of their service obligations? Are they going to have course releases? Are they going to have stipends for doing that kind of work? Like, it seems to me like there's a huge potential in the way this has been mapped out for a lot of work to be downloaded onto the shoulders of faculty members who are not being properly compensated with either course releases or stipends for doing this work.
You just identified what our chairs have been having huge conversations about. And at Dean's Executive this morning, we were also having a huge conversation about this. Who's going to do the work? How's the work going to get done? One of the goals of University of Alberta for tomorrow is to have fewer academics with administrative leadership roles and have more of that kind of work done as a part of our service function. I can accept that as a goal, but when I see a diagram that has one associate chair, I don't see that as realistic. So I'm hearing what you're saying. And what we need to do, and the chairs are working on this, is figure out how do we shift in a way that tries to reduce the amount of of labor that's required of academics that is strictly administrative labor, while also making sure that academics are in positions of leadership that give them the capacity and the time to do the things they need to do in terms of managing their programs, managing FEC, et cetera. The larger the department, the more that can be a challenge. So that needs an awful lot of attention. The beginning of what you were speaking about is the why now, and should we wait and should we not wait? That's something I thought long and hard about. When I began as dean on July 1st, there was a piece of me that wanted to say, let's step back and wait. And there's a piece of me that said, we've got to dive in. What drove me to want to dive in is wanting to control our destiny and wanting to be out in front, because the academic restructuring working group has on their agenda department restructuring as well. And I wanted them to just give us principles, not do the work for us so that we can do the work for ourselves. But one thing you'll notice is the way we've laid out the Faculty of Arts Academic Restructuring Initiative is that we have a first phase, which is what we're in now, just loose conversations, and there's lots of them going on in departments. I've been to, I don't know, double-digit meetings, just talking with people about it. Second stage, we'll be looking at some ideas, some scenarios that we might want to embrace, that we might want to question, we might want to critique. And then the third step is putting forward some proposals. And we don't have a timeline for that. I've spoken to the provost about that. And I know that what would work best for the provost and for academic restructuring overall would be if all the departments had, all the faculties had their department structures worked out when a decision is made about faculty restructuring by GFC and the Board of Governors. I haven't committed to that because I'm not sure it's possible. There's so much up in the air, so many unanswered questions that that we may have to move to, in a sense, our third stage of making final decisions after we know more. And I think that's sort of the reality we face, is that we need to be working on this project now, but we might not be able to finish this project until we know more. I think it would be a mistake to wait until we know everything and then begin, but I also think it would be a mistake to move too quickly when there are things that we don't know. So I've been trying to sort of navigate that. So I see what you're saying, because I've been trying to navigate the two sides and the two arguments. I see that we're at 101, and I see that Catherine has taken down her hand. So what I would like to do is I'd rather continue talking because I appreciate the input, but I'd like to call this to an end. I want to thank Claire and Cindy and Sheila and Sherry for setting up this event. I really appreciate your input. I expected more. I expected slightly different, but we're going to do this again on October 7th. And we're going to do a number of different things to talk specifically about restructuring within arts of our departments. October 7th, what I'm really hoping to hear from, so if some of you are planning to come back, is I'm really hoping to hear from you about your thoughts on faculty restructuring, because I need to be able to carry those ideas forward. And I know that there's some people here listening today who are on General Faculty's Council, and they also need to be able to carry those thoughts and ideas forward. So I appreciate your time. Thank you very much. And please stay in touch. And if you have other things you want to share, you can always email me at artsdean@ualberta.ca. So thank you so much.